It's a privilege to be here this morning. I used to hear preachers say that, and I said, is that something they just say? But it is a privilege to be with God's people. I think about some of the things that happened this week in our congregation. On Tuesday, the men's group went over to Becky Fox and spent a couple hours there in her yard, and a job that looked so overwhelming to one person, we kind of broke it down and got it done by lunchtime, which was a good thing because the women's group had a meal here for us, and we appreciate that as well. So it's good to see things happening, groups and people doing things that bless other folks in our congregation. Is there someone in your life that you have a special feeling for, that has done something at one time or another in your life that was very special to you, and you would sort of say they're a hero to you? Maybe somebody comes to mind right off, and you say, well, those people, that person in that situation was a hero. So how would you define a hero? I'll let you answer on this one. Okay, above and beyond the norm. Okay. Okay, is brave for you. Okay. All right, so a hero isn't a hero just by himself. There's got to be an object to the hero. Okay, so he's a person admired or respected for their courage, for their strength, and for their outstanding achievements. One who goes beyond the normal to accomplish abnormal results. Sometimes a hero is very widely influential, and sometimes known across a broad piece of society, and sometimes a hero can be very personal. There was back in the mid-'60s, there was a man in the county, his name was Oscar Goolsby. I probably wouldn't have remembered that name, but it's a little bit strange. And Oscar Goolsby had some kind of a medical emergency, and the rescue squad came in their little old bread truck we had at that time and ministered to Oscar Goolsby, and he was so profoundly moved by that he set up for our rescue squad the Oscar Goolsby Award. And so every year they would try to find somebody that had done something exceptional in the rescue squad, and they would get their name put up on the little plaque on the wall, and you would receive the Oscar Goolsby Award. Because to Oscar Goolsby, somebody was his hero in that day that he had a great medical need. Sometimes a hero can be widely influential. We think of Billy Graham and maybe a U.S. president that was very powerful or had done some marvelous things. Sometimes we do things, make heroes of people that can kick a football down the field or take a little ball this big around and hit it out of the park. And just so it's a lot of different things that we can call heroes. But anyway, I want to talk this morning about some people that made a special difference that are very little known. I could call them unsung heroes. So there's 3 little known characters in the Bible, all unnamed, but larger their life and their influence in their time and place, and sometimes even especially to this day. So if we look at 2 Kings 5, there was a maiden, and I'll read a few verses about her. It says, "Now Naaman was a commander of the army of the king of Aram, and he was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. But he was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, 'If only my master could see the prophet that is in Samaria, he would heal him of his leprosy. So we see here a maiden with a kind heart. Naaman was a man of influence, a man of power, a man of social standing. But the little word "but" comes in there, and it says that he had leprosy. Now, leprosy was basically the beginning of a death sentence. If you had leprosy, it only moved one direction. It progressed worse and worse, and you got worse and worse medical condition, worse and worse looking, until eventually the disease killed you. So eventually they became outcasts and had to live outside the city. Apparently Naaman wasn't progressed to that point yet. Maybe he was just at an entry-level leprosy, but he knew he had it, and he knew he looked ahead to very little future. But we find this little maiden that has a very kind heart, and she said, "If only my master could see the prophet in Samaria." Now, why was that an interesting statement? Look where she was. It says that bands of Aram had gone out through the countryside, and they had captured this young girl and taken her to serve for Naaman's wife. I don't know what the details were, but here's a young lady, girl. I don't know how old she was. Maybe she was your age, a little bit older. You think? But she was out. Maybe she was going down the path to her friend's house. Maybe she was out in the garden picking beans. Maybe she was in the house with her family. And this group came, and they ripped her away from her family, ripped her away from her friends, ripped her away from her culture and her religion, and took her to a strange land. It seems like a formula for bitterness to me. And if you see your master with leprosy, you would just kind of say, that's karma. It serves them right for what they did to me. But somewhere along the line, this young lady had a kind heart. And all that she could think about was that her master had leprosy, and she knew somebody that could take care of it. She cared about his well-being. She knew a prophet. She knew his power. But you think about who she was, a female in that culture. I'm glad it's changed somewhat. But anyway, she was a girl. She was a servant. She was a foreigner. She was weak. She was small, and she was insignificant. Yet her kindness was influential in starting Naaman toward a cure. I believe her kindness was influenced by two things. One is forgiveness, the ability to forgive what had happened to her, and also her faith. She knew her faith in Israel's God. I believe she knew Romans 8:28 long before it was penned, where it says, all things work together. We know that in all things God works for good to those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Somehow she knew that she had a purpose where she was. He was a somebody with leprosy. She was a nobody with a kind heart. And this story sets in motion the events that led to the healing of Naaman. Think about him. He was an enemy of God, enemy of God's people, a captive of the Syrian army. He was, humanly speaking, helpless and hopeless because he was a leper. And as a Gentile, he was a stranger to the promise and covenants of God and had no claims to his blessings. But through this little girl, he was introduced to the gospel of grace. God's grace reached out. God's grace reached out to his human need. All Naaman had to do was humble himself. If we know the rest of the story, I'll go through it a little bit. It was a pretty tough job for him. And obey the word of the Lord. And he eventually obeyed, washed in obedience to God's command, and came up with a new man with a new skin and a new heart. If I may digress a little bit, Naaman, after he received the message, went to his king. From the young girl, he went to his king, and the king sent an entourage, including Naaman to see the king of Israel. The king of Israel was like, what's going on? I don't know what to do for this fella. I can't cure him. I think that the king of Aram's trying to pick a fight with me. And Elisha was the prophet, and he said, send him over my way. Wonder why the king didn't know about Elisha. This little girl did, far away. So he said, send him over to me, and I'll take care of it. So Naaman goes over to the prophet, and the prophet sends his servant out. Says, go wash in the river 7 times. And Naaman is furious because he's a great man. He deserves to come out, have somebody come out and wave their hand over and do some magic, and he goes home cured. There's 2 things that Naaman doesn't understand. He was mad. He was going to go home. And we have some more heroes in this story. It says that his servants that were with him said, Father, if he had told you to do something great and noble, wouldn't you have been proud to do that? How much more since they said, go dip in the river? How simple is that? Do it. And so Naaman calms down and goes and dips in the river and comes up clean. Then he goes back to the prophet and says, look at all this money I brought. I'm going to give you money for this. And Elisha says, no, take it back with you. I'm not going to accept anything at your hand for what you've done for me. You think about who we are as sinners. Being a sinner is like being a leper. It only gets worse until it finally kills you. When we come to Christ, we don't tell Christ how he's supposed to cure us. We come to him humbly and say, we need you. Do what you need to do to me. Naaman thought he could go and tell the prophet how he was supposed to be cured, but it didn't work that way. And we don't come to Christ and tell him how he's supposed to fix us. We come bringing our sin to him and allow him to touch us in however way he sees fit. Another thing Naaman did was he brought money, and because he was wealthy, he brought money. And when we come to Christ, we don't buy what he has for us. The only thing we can do is, in obedience, accept what he has, the cure that he has for our sin. So Naaman eventually washed in obedience to God's command, and he came up a new man with a new skin and a new heart. And the result was, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except the God of Israel. He does something kind of interesting. He said, Elisha, let me take 2 mule loads of dirt back with me to Syria. And he made a vow to no longer worship other gods. A lot of the idea was that God was a God of Israel. Jehovah was the God of Israel, and you worshiped him in Israel. So if you took some dirt back, some soil back from Israel, back to your homeland, you could make a little place there, and you would be worshiping the God of Israel on Israel's soil. That's kind of an interesting little idea that they had back there, that gods were sort of territorial, and so you would, if you were going to worship him, you needed a place. You needed some Israel to worship the God of Israel. The forgiveness and faith of a young girl gave her a kind heart with far-reaching results. And I guess I issue a challenge here. Who among us can excuse ourselves for not showing kindness when we have the opportunity? Can you imagine Naaman telling this story? How excited he must have been when people said, hey, Naaman, where's your leprosy spot? He says, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you what the God of Israel did for me. The next person we find in John chapter 6, another unknown. we find a maiden with a kind heart, and here we find a boy with a generous heart. And this young lad is so unknown that I think John is the only place that it even mentions that he's the one that provided the lunch. So I'll read a little. It says, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he performed on the sick. And Jesus went up on a hillside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. And Jesus looked and saw a great crowd coming toward him, and he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And he asked this only to test him, for he had already had in mind what he was going to do. And Philip says, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. And another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and said, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" And again, we don't have the details of how Jesus went about getting this boy's loaves and fishes, whether he talked with him and explained to him what could happen, or whether he just simply asked and the boy in faith gave it to him. But we find that these loaves and fishes find themselves in Jesus' hands, and he blessed it and he began to break it until everyone that was there was fed, and even an abundance left over. Just for fun, I was trying to think how this would work in a material sense if you have 5,000 people. And I thought about different services I've been in where they lit a candle. This person reached out to that one and lit that one, and those people began to reach out and light until in a very short time the whole crowd was holding lighted candles. And I kind of see that happening here, where you hand this piece of bread and he breaks it and gives, and they break it and give, and in a very short time it would have been scattered through all the people. But this boy had very small resources, but God showed his power through this lunch. God uses what people have and are willing to give. If the boy would have stuck the lunch back behind his cloak and said, "No way," I don't know what Jesus would have done. He has other alternatives, but this boy was part of the power of God that showed through this miracle of the feeding of all these people. The disciples said, "Send them away." Jesus isn't in the business of sending people away. He calls people to himself. He said, "You feed them." Philip throws up his hand and says, 8 months worth of bread, wages worth of bread wouldn't give everybody a bite. And Andrew, he goes around and starts looking, what are the resources we have? He comes up with 5 loaves and 2 small fish. And he says, how far will they go? So Jesus says, have the people sit down and bring that lunch to me. God showed his power through that lunch. I believe the lad got a math lesson that day because God showed what multiplication is really like. So here's some of the lessons we can learn from it. God is in control. He was not unaware of the situation. He knew the people had need. He didn't want to send them away. He wanted to draw them to himself. God is about multiplication. He uses that which is insufficient to accomplish his purposes. Multiplication requires trust. The meal had to be released into Jesus' hand. Trust that it could be used, and for the boy, trust that his own needs would be met as well. I mean, he was the one who was smart enough to bring a lunch along. He had it. He had a few resources. He had enough to cover himself. So when he gave that to Jesus, he had to trust in some way that his own needs would be met. Multiplication often requires sacrifice. He gave his own supper up into Jesus' hand. He went from having to not having, from comfortable and secure in his own lunch to being empty-handed. Sacrifice often drives out comfort, the area where we're comfortable in. I have enough of this, I have enough of this, I have enough of this. If I give it to God, can I trust him with it? In the Old Testament, Abraham offered Isaac. I'm sure that was not a comfortable situation. He had 3 days traveling. What am I going to say to him? This wasn't a little kid. This was somebody who was probably at that time was big enough to beat him up if he needed to, because Abraham was an old man and Isaac was a strapping youth. But Abraham in obedience takes and is willing to do that. The story in the New Testament of the widow that put in 2 mites or 2 small pennies in the offering, and Jesus looked at her and said, wow, this woman is given everything she has. Not the extra out of the side of her pocket. She had a pocket. Not what she had to spare. She's given her lunch money. She's giving more than her lunch money because there's no resources beyond this. And Jesus admired her and complimented her on her generosity. Sacrifice shapes the giver's heart. It shows us things that we would have never known if we wouldn't have been willing to give it up for the sake of the kingdom. And last, multiplication is the result of God's work. When that lunch went into his hands, Jesus began to break and to feed and multiply that over and over. Jesus used the disciples to serve. It says, you take and give it to them. He used the little boy to sharing and to for the provision for the group. And even today, God uses his people to work in his kingdom. He allows us to be part of what's going on in his kingdom. And we should be honored, I guess, to be willing to be part of what he has going on. Trust him. Be generous and trust him with your resources. Let him multiply in ways you could never imagine. Don't have the reference, but there's a verse that says, now to him who is able to do beyond what we can think or imagine. What do we have? Are we willing to reach out and share that and to see what God can do beyond what we can think or imagine? So we have a kind heart and we have a generous heart. And over in Acts, we have a story about someone that had a brave heart. Uncle Paul, this fellow in the story is, again, an unnamed young person, is Paul's nephew, Paul the Apostle. Paul the Apostle was in trouble. The Jews were upset with him. They said that he brought a Gentile into the temple, which was very insulting. And then as Paul defended himself, they felt more and more insulted by what he was saying. Not that Paul was telling the untruth or was being unkind, but because of the conviction in their heart, they hated Paul more and more. So Paul was taken and put under guard, by the Roman government. And there were some people that said, we're going to get this Paul. So they said, you priest, you go get Paul tomorrow morning and tell the guards that we want to talk to Paul more about what's going on here. We want to get more information. He says, the next morning the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. And they went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about this case, and we are ready to kill him before he gets here. But the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, and he went to the barracks and told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. Can you imagine how intimidating that was? This big soldier taking him there and taking him to the head of all the guard. And the centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked him to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." And the commander took the young man by the hand and drew him aside and says, "What is it you want to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him, and they have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." And the commander dismissed the young man and cautioned him, "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." You know, the difference between a snitch and a hero is which side you're on. If you were one of those 40 men, you'd say, "Somebody snitched on us," and that commander of the army knew that too. He said, "You better keep this under your hat, because there's 40 angry men out there that are looking for who it was that blew their cover." I think he's on the hero side myself. Just thought I'd bring that. So this young man has the courage, a courageous heart, and he goes and tells the commander what's going to happen. And so the two centurions, they got a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, and they went to Caesarea at 9 o'clock that very night. So Paul was delivered by the Roman Empire out of the hands of these that had plotted against him. Think about what happened in Paul's life after this event. Paul goes to Rome. He goes to trial before Felix. He goes on trial before Agrippa. He is on the ship that goes on the way to Rome, and it's shipwrecked. And Paul comes out and says, everybody on the ship is going to be safe. God gave them, everyone on the ship, because of the presence of Paul. He was in Rome a number of years, and he wrote letters. A lot of the New Testament was written from Rome. And then tradition has it that when he was released from Rome, he traveled to Asia Minor, the island of Crete, and to Greece. And the extension of Paul's life by the virtue of the young man's report had positive consequences even to this day. So, you might not think you're too much, which is fine. You may not think you have much to offer. In 1 Corinthians 1:26, it says, "Brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many of you were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of the world, the despised things, and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one could boast before him." These young folks in today's lesson all took advantage of the situation in which they found themselves and made the name and power of God a true reality. Most of us, if not all of us, will live lives of relative obscurity. Most will not operate out of gifts that lift us into the limelight, but how many of us will have an opportunity to show kindness? How many will have an opportunity to give a word of encouragement, a compliment for a job well done, a shared meal, a gift given secretly in time of need, a helping hand when things seem overwhelming? What ways can we demonstrate kindness to others. My wife's parents were in a church that didn't really appreciate Daddy Showalter and his ministry, and it was a very rough time for the family. Was it a whole year, honey? For a whole year, somebody came to their house and brought a pie. And they said, somebody made this pie for you, and we're sharing it with you. Every week for a year, somebody brought a pie to encourage Mom and Daddy Showalter. And to this day, they do not know who it was, because the person that delivered the pie obviously wasn't the one that made it. Kindness, ongoing kindness over and over and over to encourage those two people that were being as faithful as they knew how to the Lord. There was a new school teacher years ago that came to Powhatan, and Mom made her a winter garden. I don't know if you know what a winter garden. You take a little fish bowl and you put some little tiny moss from the forest, and you put some little lichen called British soldier with little red tops on, and you put some partridge berries in, and then you put a little mirror down in there and a little toy deer by it, and then you put a plastic over the top, and it stays nice and green and fresh for months and months. So Mom brought this winter garden to the new school teacher that had just moved into the area and gave it to her. And years later, I was talking to her, and she said, when I first came here, your mother brought me a winter garden and let me know that I was welcome here. Now, how hard was that? Such a small thing, and yet it spoke to that school teacher for years and years to come. I remember once when I first started teaching the youth, God bless them, I had a day that it just didn't go at all. And I kind of was done. I just kind of leaned back like that. And I'm like, I bet they're glad it's over. And somebody knew it was a young lady came up to me, and she just expressed appreciation. And it just made a lot of difference to me she knew I didn't do a good job. And she knew there wasn't exciting. It was probably a boring place to be that morning. But those little words of encouragement meant a lot to me. And obviously I remember to this day. So you never know. And I'll be honest, I made one of my New Year's resolutions was to look for more opportunities to be kind, because I tend to have a sharp tongue, and I'm kind of quick-witted, and I can make little cuts and digs. And I said, you know what? They're not very kind. I can be a more kind person. I can look for things to say thank you for. I can look for things to commend. And so if you catch me violating my resolution this year, you remind me that I stood in front of the church and said that I was going to try to be more kind this year. So, one more thing before I leave that. I remember my son John Michael was coming into his adolescence a little more, and one day he was playing church ball and he hit a home run, and I never forgot it. The first person to congratulate him when he hit home base was the pitcher that pitched the pitch, and he recognized that though he had a home run hit against him, that he recognized that this young man, that was quite an accomplishment, and he was willing to commend him for what he had done. A little bit of kindness, a little bit of encouragement. And I bet you John Michael remembers that as well to this day. Okay, how about sharing? Like the loaves and fishes. And I realize that there's got to be some overlap, because you don't usually share unless you're kind. But, think about things that you can do. And money gifts, even Sunday morning offerings are a way of giving. Offer to help with chores. We bring meals to people to people at our church that are in need of that. Even if you break your little finger, they'll bring you some meals, and that's very kind, and it's very, very, very precious thing, and we appreciate that too. How can we help? We can clean up or mow the yard like we did for Becky Fox. I remember once I was in Pennsylvania visiting, and we were visiting a church where my cousin preached, and I was looking for some hay while I was up there because it was so dry. And Lancaster County, they don't really know what drought is too much. And, if the corn's shorter than 11 feet, they think they've had a drought. But anyway, so we were talking, and I said, yeah, we really had a dry year down here. And they said, yeah, we're having a dry year up here too. And I said, yeah, our county average for corn this year was 11 bushel to the acre. They said, well, you did have a drought, didn't you? A few weeks later, here comes a 15-ton load of hay donated by our friends from Pennsylvania. Talk about kindness. So, be creative. What are some ways that you can help other people? My brother-in-law lost their son, and he worked for a small landscaping business, and that business came in before all the guests came to their house, mowed their yard, redid their flower beds, put new flowers all around, so when the guests came in, their place was pretty, and there was a refreshing place to come to, and they could look and see the kindness of those strangers. So, there's lots of things we can do. Just open your eyes and look for them. I don't know how many people across the world are sleeping under warm blankets, and I won't name her name because she would be embarrassed, but I know that there's people that have ministered in that way over and over again, and I'm sure there's people that bless that woman, whoever she is, even though they will probably never meet her till in glory. So we have a kind heart, we have a generous heart, and we have a courageous heart. Can we speak up for those who don't have a voice of their own? Speak up for those who need it. Speak out on others' behalf. Speak out, share the gospel message with them. Paul's life was extended, and a lot of his ministry came after the fact that his nephew reported those 40 that were going to kill Paul. So we may never be a Billy Graham or a David Jeremiah or some other Christian speaker evangelist. And so we talked about these unsung heroes, perhaps an unfair description, but indeed not much is recorded about them. But by the kindness of a maiden, a captain was healed, and the knowledge of the God of Israel was carried into Syria. By the generosity of a lad, the hunger of thousands was satisfied, and the crowds began to dimly understand that this Jesus was the bread of life. And by the courage of a nephew, the life of a great missionary was spared, and continue his missions, and eventually write for us a large portion of what we now know as the New Testament, giving directions even to this day to thousands of Christians. Which only goes to show by the use of these unsung heroes, God is able to accomplish great things and truly uses the seemingly insignificant persons of this world to accomplish his purposes. I'd like to close with a verse. For all of us, it says, therefore, as you have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially those of the household of faith. Who here doesn't have opportunities to do good? Be conscious and be aware of them and take advantage of them when they come your way. Let's pray. 3 unknown people mentioned in the Bible. What an influence their kindness, their generosity, and their courage had. And you call us, Father, to be your children, Father, to look for opportunities to do for others. So give us a sensitivity to that in this new year. Thank you for what you've done to us, for us, in saving us and making us part of your family. In gratitude, help us reach out in kindness to those around us. For your kingdom's sake, amen.